In the gleaming towers of Silicon Valley, a brilliant engineer was about to discover the ultimate betrayal. What started as a late-night coding session took a shocking turn when they came face-to-face with 5 years of systematic theft. Lauren Fletcher wasn't your typical tech employee. For half a decade, she had spent her life creating revolutionary AI innovations, known for her groundbreaking design algorithms. When she encountered her boss's stolen presentation that night, she had no idea she was walking into a corporate war that would transform her from victim to ruthless CEO, leading to the complete destruction of everything her mentor had built. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights in the Nexus Industries office cast their familiar sickly glow across Lauren Fletcher's dual monitors at 9:47 p.m. on a Thursday that had stretched far beyond reasonable boundaries. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with the mechanical precision of someone who had long ago stopped counting the hours she spent perfecting code that would never bear her name. The office floor stretched empty around her, a landscape of abandoned coffee cups and darkened workstations where her colleagues had fled hours ago to lives that didn't revolve around the relentless pursuit of someone else's vision. Lauren paused, rolling her shoulders to work out the knots that had taken permanent residence there. 5 years at Nexus had taught her that innovation happened in the quiet hours, when the political theater of meetings and presentations gave way to the honest work of creation. Tonight, she was putting the finishing touches on her revolutionary AI-assisted design platform, a system that could analyze user behavior patterns and generate intuitive interface designs in real time. It was elegant, groundbreaking work that represented months of 18-hour days, and the kind of breakthrough thinking that defined careers. She saved her progress and leaned back, allowing herself a moment of satisfaction. Tomorrow's team meeting would be another exercise in watching Richard Blackwood, her supervisor and VP of Product Development, nod thoughtfully at her explanations, before inevitably finding ways to refine her concepts into something more market-ready. But tonight, in the silence of the empty office, the work was purely hers. A notification chimed on her secondary monitor, an automated backup completion from the shared development server. Lauren glanced at it absently, then froze. The backup directory showed a folder she didn't recognize. RB_CEO_presentation_final. Her stomach clenched with an intuition she didn't want to acknowledge. Richard's CEO presentation. The one he'd been mysteriously secretive about, deflecting questions with his practiced smile and vague references to strategic initiatives. Lauren's hands moved without conscious thought, navigating to the folder despite the voice in her head, warning her that some discoveries changed everything. The presentation file opened with Richard's polished corporate template, his photo prominently displayed alongside the Nexus logo. But as Lauren scrolled through the slides, her breath caught in her throat. There, rendered in Richard's signature presentation style, was her AI-assisted design platform. Every algorithm, every innovative interface solution, every breakthrough insight she'd developed over the past 18 months, all of it repackaged as Blackwood's revolutionary design intelligence system. Her hands trembled as she clicked through slide after slide of her stolen work. The technical specifications were identical to her documentation, down to the variable names she'd chosen. The user experience philosophy was lifted verbatim from her design proposals. Even the market analysis reflected research she'd conducted on her own time, using methodologies she'd learned from her immigrant engineer parents, who had taught her that excellence required both innovation and meticulous preparation. Lauren's mind raced backward through 5 years of similar moments. The predictive user interface concept that had become Richard's intuitive design framework. The revolutionary accessibility features that had earned him recognition at the annual design conference. The machine learning optimization protocols that had secured him his current vice presidency. All of it, she now realized with crystalline clarity, had been her work, systematically harvested and rebranded. She opened her email archive and began searching, her analytical mind shifting into the methodical mode that had made her such an effective designer. The evidence was overwhelming once she knew what to look for. Email chains where Richard requested background research, that mysteriously aligned with his subsequent presentations. Development notes that disappeared from shared folders only to resurface as his strategic initiatives. Performance reviews where her lack of big-picture thinking had been cited even as her innovations drove the company's success. The pattern was breathtaking in its audacity and devastating in its implications. Richard hadn't just stolen her ideas. He had systematically erased her contributions while building his reputation on her intellectual labor. The promotion to CEO, the industry recognition, the speaking engagements, all of it built on foundations he had stolen from her. Lauren printed the presentation, her movements sharp with controlled fury. The laser printer's mechanical whirring filled the empty office like a countdown timer. As the pages emerged, she began formulating her approach. Richard typically arrived at 7:30 a.m., always eager to be seen as the first executive in the office. She would be waiting. Sleep was impossible. Lauren spent the night in her apartment methodically building her case, cross-referencing timestamps, documenting the evolution of her stolen ideas, creating an irrefutable timeline of intellectual theft. Her Stanford engineering training had taught her to approach problems systematically, and this was simply another problem to be solved, albeit one that had the power to redefine her entire understanding of her professional life. At 7:25 a.m., Lauren sat in the chair across from Richard's desk, the printed presentation in her lap, and 5 years of suppressed recognition burning in her chest. When Richard arrived with his customary coffee and confident stride, his practiced smile faltered at the sight of her. "Lauren, early morning meeting I forgot about?" His voice carried its usual smooth confidence, but his eyes flickered to the papers in her hands. "We need to talk, Richard." Lauren's voice was steady, professional. She placed the presentation on his desk, open to the title slide. "About your CEO presentation." Richard's expression shifted through several calculations before settling on bemused confusion. "I'm not sure what you mean. This is sensitive executive material. This is my work, Richard. Every algorithm, every design principle, every innovation in this presentation came from my research and development." Lauren's words were precise, each one chosen for maximum clarity. "I have documentation going back 18 months, proving that what you're calling Blackwood's revolutionary design intelligence system is actually my AI-assisted design platform." For a moment, Richard's mask slipped, revealing something cold and calculating. The encrypted drive hidden in her desk drawer contained terabytes of documentation. She had learned to time her evidence gathering to Richard's predictable schedule, his morning coffee ritual, his extended lunch meetings, his afternoon strategic thinking walks that everyone knew were actually phone calls with his golf partners. During these windows, Lauren moved through the shared servers like a digital archaeologist, uncovering layers of intellectual theft that went back to the beginning of Richard's tenure. Her methodology was surgical. Every file she accessed was copied to multiple encrypted locations, with timestamps and metadata preserved. She documented not just her own stolen work, but patterns that suggested Richard had been systematically harvesting innovations from his entire team. The predictive analytics breakthrough that had earned him a Forbes mention, actually developed by their intern, Marcus Thompson, who had been too intimidated to speak up. The award-winning accessibility framework, lifted from detailed proposals submitted by Alex Rivera, the brilliant developer who worked 3 cubicles over from Lauren. Alex. Lauren had been watching him for weeks now, noting his growing frustration during team meetings, when Richard would casually reference, quote, his innovations that Alex had actually created. Unlike Lauren, Alex wore his emotions openly, the tightening around his eyes when Richard claimed credit, the way his hands clenched when their supposed leader pontificated about vision and market understanding. She made her approach during the Thursday afternoon lull, when most of the team was in the weekly status meeting she had strategically skipped. Alex was hunched over his workstation, debugging code with the intense focus she recognized in herself. "Working on anything interesting?" Lauren kept her voice casual, settling into the chair beside his desk. Alex glanced up, his dark eyes showing the exhaustion that had become common among Richard's direct reports. "Just the usual fire drill. Richard wants the user authentication system redesigned by Monday, because apparently our current approach, lacks elegance. He made air quotes with obvious frustration. Lauren nodded sympathetically, while internally cataloging the information. Richard's pattern was always the same: vague criticisms that created opportunities for him to swoop in with improvements that were actually wholesale replacements of his team's work with previous innovations he had stolen. "Funny thing about elegance," Lauren said carefully. "I was looking at some of Richard's older presentations yesterday, and I noticed how his design philosophy has evolved. Remember that machine learning optimization protocol he presented at the conference last year?" Alex's hand stilled on his keyboard. "The one that got him the promotion to VP? That's the one. The implementation details looked familiar to me. Reminded me of some research I'd done on adaptive algorithms." Lauren watched Alex's expression carefully. "I'm probably wrong, but didn't you write something similar for the client portal redesign?" The silence stretched between them, filled with the ambient hum of servers and distant conversations. Alex turned in his chair to face her directly, his expression shifting from exhaustion to something sharper. "You noticed that too?" His voice was barely above a whisper. Lauren felt a surge of validation mixed with strategic satisfaction. Alex had been aware of the theft but had lacked the framework to understand its scope. She was offering him that framework, and in return, she was gaining an ally who could provide technical expertise and moral support for what she was planning. "I've been noticing a lot of things lately," Lauren said. "Patterns. Inconsistencies. Things that don't add up when you really examine them." Alex leaned closer, his programmer's mind already making connections. "The predictive user interface concept, the one that landed him the Bloomberg interview. I wrote the core algorithms for that 2 years ago. And the accessibility framework that won the industry award? Mine. Completely mine. I even have the original documentation." Alex's voice carried a tremor of anger that Lauren recognized from her own recent awakening. They spent the next hour in Alex's cubicle, speaking in the careful code of two people discovering they shared a dangerous secret. Lauren revealed selected pieces of her evidence, while Alex confirmed suspicions she had been building about Richard's systematic exploitation of the entire team. It was a delicate dance. She needed Alex's technical knowledge and insider perspective, but she also needed to maintain control of the larger strategy she was developing. "The question is," Lauren said as they prepared to return to their normal work routines, "what do we do about it?" Alex's expression was troubled. "HR? The executive team? There have to be proper channels. Richard sits on the executive committee. He's been building political capital for 5 years using our innovations. Do you really think proper channels are going to work against someone who's that connected?" Lauren kept her tone reasonable, letting Alex reach the logical conclusion himself. The doubt in Alex's eyes confirmed what Lauren had suspected. He was principled, idealistic in the way that made him a brilliant developer, but vulnerable in corporate politics. He would follow her lead if she could provide him with a framework that preserved his sense of moral clarity. "There might be other options," Lauren said carefully. "Legal options. Documentation that could prove systematic intellectual property theft. But it would require being very careful about how we gather evidence." Alex nodded slowly, his analytical mind already processing the implications. "You're talking about building a case. A real case with documentation and proof." "I'm talking about justice," Lauren corrected. "Richard has stolen years of our work, our innovations, our careers. Someone needs to hold him accountable." That evening, Lauren worked late again, but this time she wasn't alone. Alex had volunteered to help organize the evidence, bringing his own documentation and a programmer's systematic approach to data analysis. They worked in the conference room with its glass walls, maintaining the appearance of a normal project collaboration while actually constructing the foundation for Richard's professional destruction. As they sorted through files and cross-referenced timestamps, Lauren felt a satisfaction that had nothing to do with technical achievement. She was building something more complex than any user interface, a trap constructed from Richard's own arrogance and systematic exploitation. Every stolen innovation became a piece of evidence. Every casual dismissal of his team's contributions became documentation of his character. "This is bigger than I thought," Alex said, looking at the timeline they had constructed. It's not just theft, it's fraud. He's built his entire career on other people's work. Lauren nodded, watching Alex's transformation from frustrated employee to committed ally. She was learning skills that had never been part of her engineering education. How to read people, how to build trust, how to channel someone else's anger into strategic action. The naive engineer who had confronted Richard 3 days ago was evolving into something more dangerous. The question now, she said, is whether we're content to just document this, or if we want to do something about it. Alex met her eyes with newfound determination. What did you have in mind? Lauren smiled, feeling the same predatory satisfaction she had experienced in the elevator. Richard had taught her that in the corporate world, justice wasn't given, it was taken, and she was finally ready to take what was owed to her. The Palo Alto coffee shop buzzed with the familiar energy of Silicon Valley networking. Venture capitalists in designer jeans, startup founders pitching over espresso, and the subtle power dynamics that Lauren had observed from the periphery for years, but never actively participated in. Today, however, she sat across from Sarah Kim, the woman whose career trajectory she had studied like a technical manual, waiting for a conversation that could change everything. Sarah arrived precisely on time, her presence commanding without being obvious. At 52, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had fought similar battles and emerged victorious. Lauren recognized the careful balance, professional enough to be taken seriously, approachable enough to mentor other women, but with an underlying steel that warned against underestimation. Lauren Fletcher, Sarah said, settling into her chair with a smile that reached her eyes. I've been curious about you since your work on the accessibility framework made waves at the design conference. Though I notice Richard Blackwood seemed to get most of the credit for that particular innovation. The observation hit like a perfectly aimed arrow. Lauren had expected to need time to build trust, to carefully reveal her situation, but Sarah's opening indicated she already understood the landscape. You noticed that, did you? Lauren kept her voice level, but internally she felt a surge of hope. If Sarah had already identified the discrepancy, perhaps this conversation would be more straightforward than she had anticipated. I've been in this industry for 25 years. I know what stolen innovation looks like. Sarah's expression grew serious. The question is what you plan to do about it. Lauren had rehearsed this moment, but Sarah's directness threw her prepared script out the window. Instead, she found herself speaking with raw honesty about the pattern of theft, the systematic exploitation, and the evidence she had been gathering. She described Richard's dismissive attitude, the casual way he had claimed ownership of her life's work, and the gradual erosion of her belief that excellence would be recognized and rewarded. As she spoke, Sarah listened with the focused attention of someone who had heard similar stories, but understood that each instance carried its own unique pain. When Lauren finished, Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her fingers wrapped around her coffee cup. I built my first company when I was 31, Sarah said finally. Had a brilliant technical co-founder who gradually pushed me out of the strategic discussions, claiming I lacked the vision for scale. By the time I realized what was happening, he had repositioned himself as the sole founder and me as an early employee. I lost everything: equity, credit, control over technology I had conceptualized. Lauren felt a chill of recognition. What did you do? I fought back. Legally, professionally, personally. I spent 3 years in litigation that consumed my savings and my sanity. I won. Eventually. But the victory was Pyrrhic. The company died during the legal battle. The technology became obsolete. And I learned that sometimes winning feels a lot like losing. The warning was clear, but Lauren detected something else in Sarah's tone. A recognition of the hunger for justice that couldn't be satisfied through conventional means. But you built another company, Lauren said. 2 successful companies, actually. You didn't let him destroy your career. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah's smile carried complexity that Lauren was only beginning to understand. I learned that the best revenge is massive success. But I also learned that becoming the monster you're fighting against isn't success. It's just a different kind of failure. They talked for 2 hours, Sarah sharing stories of corporate battles and strategic victories that had nothing to do with product development and everything to do with understanding power dynamics. Lauren found herself absorbing lessons she had never learned in engineering school: how to read board dynamics, how to leverage investor relationships, how to position intellectual property battles in terms of market opportunity rather than personal grievance. "If you're serious about this," Sarah said as their conversation wound toward decision time, "I can help you. I can provide seed funding for your own company, introduce you to clients who value innovation over politics, and connect you with legal resources that understand intellectual property law. But I have conditions." Lauren's pulse quickened. This was the opportunity she had hoped for but hadn't dared expect. "First," Sarah continued, "you don't become Richard. The moment you start using his tactics, manipulation, exploitation, systematic deception, you lose my support. Fighting monsters is necessary sometimes, but becoming one is always a choice." The words hit deeper than Lauren had expected. She had spent the past week learning to deceive, to read people strategically, to build alliances based on shared grievances rather than genuine collaboration. Sarah was offering her a path forward that didn't require abandoning her principles, but Lauren wasn't sure she still knew where those principles were. Second, you focus on building something better rather than just destroying what he's built. Your innovations deserve to exist in the world under your name, but that requires creating value, not just proving theft. Lauren nodded, though internally she felt the tension between justice and creation. Building something new was the long-term goal, but Richard's immediate threat to her career required more direct action. "And third," Sarah said, her voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom, "you remember that revenge is a luxury you can't afford if you want to build something lasting. Richard's downfall might be satisfying, but your success is what actually matters." The conversation ended with Sarah's commitment to provide $2 million in seed funding and strategic guidance, contingent on Lauren's ability to maintain ethical standards while pursuing justice. As they parted ways, Lauren felt both exhilarated by the opportunity and sobered by the constraints Sarah had placed on her support. Walking back to her car, Lauren's phone buzzed with a text from Alex. "Richard just called an emergency team meeting. Says there's been a security breach in the development servers." Lauren's blood chilled. Her evidence gathering had been careful, but perhaps not careful enough. If Richard had discovered her activities, everything could unravel before she had a chance to act. She drove back to Nexus, with her mind racing through contingencies and damage control scenarios. Sarah's words echoed in her thoughts. The warning about becoming the monster she was fighting, the emphasis on creation over destruction. But as the Nexus building came into view, Lauren felt the familiar surge of strategic calculation that had become her new default mode. Richard had taught her that in the corporate world, nice people finish last. Sarah was offering her a different path, but it would require trusting that justice could be achieved without sacrificing her integrity. As Lauren walked toward what might be her final confrontation with Richard as his employee, she realized she was about to discover which lesson would prove stronger: Sarah's wisdom about building something better, or Richard's demonstration that power belonged to those willing to take it. The choice, she understood with crystalline clarity, would define not just her career but the person she was becoming. And for better or worse, she was no longer the naive engineer who had believed that excellence spoke for itself. Lauren's heart hammered against her ribs as she approached the conference room where Richard's emergency meeting was already in session. Through the glass walls, she could see her teammates clustered around the table, their expressions ranging from confused to concerned. Richard stood at the head of the room, his usual confident posture intact, but something sharp and predatory in his eyes that she had never seen before. The moment she entered, the room fell silent. Richard's gaze locked onto hers with laser focus, and Lauren felt the weight of everyone's attention. Alex sat rigidly in his chair, his face carefully neutral, but she caught the slight shake of his head, a warning. "Lauren?" Richard's voice carried its usual smooth authority, but underneath lay something colder. "Perfect timing. We were just discussing some irregularities in our server access logs. It seems someone has been conducting unauthorized reviews of sensitive executive materials." Lauren felt the trap closing around her, but instead of the panic she might have expected, she experienced an almost euphoric clarity. This was it, the moment that would determine whether she remained Richard's victim or became something else entirely. Sarah's warnings about becoming a monster echoed in her mind, but they were overwhelmed by 5 years of suppressed rage and the tactical thinking that had become her new reality. "That's concerning," Lauren said, settling into an empty chair with deliberate calm. "Corporate espionage is a serious issue. Have you contacted IT security?" Richard's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "We're handling it internally for now. Though I'm curious, do you have any thoughts on who might have access to my CEO presentation materials?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Lauren could feel her teammates' confusion. They didn't understand the subtext of this conversation, the deeper war being fought beneath the surface of corporate politeness. Only Alex seemed to grasp the stakes, his knuckles white where they gripped his coffee cup. "Actually, Richard, I do have thoughts about your CEO presentation." Lauren's voice was steady, professional. "Several thoughts, in fact. About attribution, intellectual property, and the ethical implications of claiming credit for work you didn't create." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Richard's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing genuine surprise that she was meeting his attack head-on, rather than retreating. "I think this conversation might be better suited for a private setting," Richard said, his voice carrying a warning. "No, I think our team should hear this." Lauren stood, moving to the whiteboard where Richard often sketched out his visionary concepts. "Since we're talking about unauthorized access, let's discuss something interesting I discovered. Did you know that the revolutionary AI-assisted design platform in your CEO presentation contains code I wrote, algorithms I developed, design philosophies I created?" The room erupted in murmurs as Lauren began writing on the whiteboard, specific function names, algorithm structures, technical details that only the original creator would know. Her teammates leaned forward, recognition dawning on several faces as they identified work they had seen Lauren develop over the past months. "Lauren, you're making serious accusations." Richard's voice carried a note of desperation now. "I'm making factual statements," Lauren interrupted, turning back to face him. "And I have documentation to prove every single one. Email threads, development logs, version control history. Everything needed to demonstrate that what you're calling Blackwood's revolutionary design intelligence system is actually my intellectual property." Alex cleared his throat. "The machine learning optimization protocols, too. Those are based on research I conducted for the client portal redesign." Lauren felt a surge of gratitude and strategic satisfaction. Alex was making his choice, stepping out from under Richard's protection to stand with her. Other voices joined in, Marcus mentioning his predictive analytics work, Jennifer from HR quietly noting the pattern of credit attribution she had observed in performance reviews. Richard's confident facade was crumbling in real time. "This is ridiculous. Individual contributors provide research and implementation, but strategic vision, market positioning, executive synthesis, that's leadership work. That's what separates. What separates leaders from thieves?" Lauren's voice cut through his justification like a blade. "Because from where I'm sitting, Richard, you look a lot more like the latter." The silence that followed was deafening. Lauren could see her teammates processing the implications, understanding for the first time the systematic nature of Richard's exploitation. Some looked shocked, others angry, but none looked surprised. They had all felt the dissonance between Richard's claimed innovations and their own contributions. Lauren pulled a letter from her folder, placing it on the conference table. "Which brings me to my actual reason for joining this meeting. My resignation, effective immediately." Richard's eyes widened. "Lauren, let's not make hasty decisions. Whatever issues you think exist, we can work through them. Your career." "My career will be just fine," Lauren said, her voice carrying new authority. "I'm starting my own company, Catalyst Design. We'll be focusing on AI-assisted user experience platforms technologies I actually created rather than claimed to create. She turned to address the room. Alex, Marcus, Jennifer, I'll be in touch. I think you'll find that working somewhere that values actual innovation over political theater might be refreshing. As Lauren gathered her materials, Richard's desperation became palpable. You can't do this. Non-compete agreements, intellectual property clauses. Based on intellectual property I created that you stole, I think my lawyers will have some interesting arguments about the enforceability of those contracts. Lauren paused at the door, her hand on the handle. Oh, and Richard? You might want to review your CEO presentation one more time. I believe there's a board meeting next week where you'll be presenting my work as your own. That could be awkward. The parking garage encounter happened 20 minutes later. As Lauren loaded her personal items into her car, Richard appeared like a predator stalking wounded prey, his corporate mask finally abandoned. You have no idea what you're doing, he snarled, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. You think you can just walk away? Destroy my career? I built this department. I built those innovations into something market-ready. Lauren turned slowly, and Richard stepped back at whatever he saw in her expression. You built nothing, Richard. You're a parasite who feeds on other people's creativity. But parasites only survive as long as their hosts remain weak. This isn't over. Richard's voice was raw with fury. I have connections, resources, legal options. I'll destroy your little startup before it gets off the ground. Lauren smiled, and for the first time in 5 years, it was genuinely predatory. Bring it on, Richard. Let's see how your connections feel about systematic intellectual property theft. Let's see how your resources hold up against actual innovation. Let's see how your legal options work when the evidence is overwhelming. As she drove away from Nexus Industries for the last time, Lauren felt intoxicated by her own power. The scared, overlooked engineer was gone, replaced by someone who understood that justice wasn't something you requested, it was something you took. Sarah's warnings about becoming a monster seemed distant and theoretical compared to the rush of finally fighting back. But even as she savored her victory, a small voice in the back of her mind wondered if the person she was becoming was someone she would recognize a year from now. The line between justice and revenge was blurring, and Lauren was discovering that she didn't mind the view from the darker side. 3 months after her dramatic departure from Nexus, Lauren stood in the converted warehouse that served as Catalyst Design's headquarters, watching Alex debug code on a massive wall-mounted display, while Marcus Thompson, her first major poaching success, worked through client requirements at a standing desk nearby. The space hummed with the productive energy of a startup that had hit its stride, but beneath the surface satisfaction, Lauren felt the constant pressure of decisions that were reshaping her into someone she barely recognized. The transformation hadn't been gradual. Each day brought choices that required her to prioritize results over relationships, strategy over sentiment. The Lauren who had confronted Richard 3 months ago had still believed in playing fairly within an unfair system. The woman who now commanded this growing company understood that fairness was a luxury she couldn't afford. We got the Morrison account, Alex announced, turning from his screen with a grin that still carried traces of the idealistic developer she had first recruited. They're moving their entire user experience platform to our AI system. Lauren felt the familiar rush of vindication. Morrison had been Nexus's flagship client for 5 years, and their defection represented more than just revenue. It was proof that her innovations could compete in the market without Richard's political protection. But even as she celebrated internally, her mind was already calculating the implications. What did you promise them on timeline? She asked, pulling up the project specifications on her tablet. 6 months for full implementation, but I think we can deliver in 4 if we hire away Nexus's West Coast implementation team, Lauren finished, her voice carrying a new authority that sometimes surprised even her. Jennifer Walsh sent me their employee satisfaction surveys last week. 3 of their senior developers are already looking for new opportunities. Alex's expression shifted, the easy confidence replaced by something more cautious. Lauren, we've talked about this. Actively recruiting their entire teams feels like competition? Lauren's tone was sharper than she intended, but she was tired of having the same conversation. Alex, Richard is actively sabotaging our client prospects through his industry connections. He's filed 3 frivolous patent challenges against our core algorithms. He's spreading rumors about our financial stability to venture capital firms. We're not playing tiddlywinks here. Quote. The silence that followed carried weight. Marcus looked up from his work, recognizing the tension that had become increasingly common between Lauren and Alex. These moments revealed the fundamental difference in their approaches. Alex still believed in competing on merit alone, while Lauren had learned that survival required matching her opponent's tactics. I'm not saying we shouldn't compete aggressively, Alex said carefully. I'm saying we should compete ethically. There's a difference between winning and what? Becoming like Richard? Lauren's laugh carried an edge that made Alex flinch. The difference, Alex, is that Richard steals innovations. We're recruiting talent that's being systematically undervalued and exploited. We're offering people opportunities to work on genuine innovation, instead of having their ideas stolen. It was a rationalization, and they both knew it. The developers Lauren was targeting weren't just talented. They were specifically chosen for their knowledge of Nexus's internal operations, client relationships, and competitive vulnerabilities. She was building her team not just for their skills, but for the damage their departure would cause to Richard's operations. Jennifer Walsh's insider information had made the recruitment process devastatingly effective. Lauren knew which developers were frustrated with their current projects, who was being passed over for promotions, which teams were struggling with unrealistic deadlines. She approached each target with perfectly calibrated offers that addressed their specific pain points, while positioning Catalyst as their path to professional recognition. The strategy was working. 3 senior developers had joined Catalyst in the past month, bringing with them institutional knowledge that accelerated every aspect of the company's growth. But their arrival had also brought Alex's growing discomfort with Lauren's methods into sharp focus. Sarah Kim called yesterday, Alex said, his voice carefully neutral. She wants to schedule a check-in meeting. Lauren's stomach tightened. Sarah's mentorship had been invaluable during Catalyst's launch, but her emphasis on ethical competition increasingly felt like a constraint rather than guidance. The last 2 conversations had carried subtle warnings about maintaining integrity while scaling the business, warnings that Lauren found increasingly irrelevant as she discovered how effective ruthless tactics could be. What did you tell her? That you'd call her back? Alex paused. Lauren, she's been good to us. The funding, the client introductions, the strategic advice. I know what she's done for us, Lauren interrupted. But Sarah built her companies in a different era. The market is more competitive now, the stakes are higher. Richard isn't going to be defeated by playing nice. As if summoned by their conversation, Lauren's phone buzzed with a message from Jennifer Walsh. Nexus losing another major client next week. Morrison defection started domino effect. Richard calling emergency board meeting to address, quote, competitive threats. Time to push harder? Lauren felt the familiar surge of predatory satisfaction. Richard's empire was cracking, and she was holding the hammer. But Alex's troubled expression reminded her that each victory came with costs she was still learning to calculate. That evening, alone in her apartment with financial projections spread across her dining table, Lauren reviewed Catalyst's meteoric growth. Revenue was exceeding all projections, client satisfaction was unprecedented, and her AI platform was generating industry buzz that validated years of stolen recognition. By every measurable standard, she was succeeding beyond her wildest expectations. But when she looked in the bathroom mirror before bed, the woman staring back was someone she struggled to recognize. The idealistic engineer who had believed in meritocracy was gone, replaced by someone who understood that power belonged to those willing to seize it. The question that kept her awake wasn't whether she was winning. It was whether the person she was becoming was worth the victory. Her phone buzzed with another message from Jennifer. Richard's private emails suggest he's considering legal action against you personally. Might be time to consider preemptive measures. Lauren stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back, schedule a meeting. Let's discuss options. As she sent the response, she realized she had crossed another line without even noticing. The battle with Richard had become personal, and she was discovering that personal battles required personal weapons. Sarah's warnings about becoming a monster seemed increasingly naive compared to the reality of corporate warfare. The woman in the mirror smiled back at her, and for the first time, Lauren didn't flinch at what she saw. She was building an empire, and empires weren't built by people who worried about playing fair. David Blackwood pushed his wire-rimmed glasses up his nose and stared at the wall of documents covering his San Francisco apartment. A constellation of corporate emails, financial records, and whistleblower testimonies that told a story of systematic intellectual property theft in Silicon Valley. For 3 months, he had been chasing leads about innovation laundering in tech companies, not knowing that the epicenter of his investigation would lead him straight to his own family. The irony wasn't lost on him. While Richard had built a career on corporate networking and political maneuvering, David had deliberately chosen investigative journalism as his path, a way to differentiate himself from the Blackwood family's obsession with wealth and status. Their relationship had been strained for years, built on polite holiday conversations that carefully avoided David's exposés of corporate corruption and Richard's increasingly prominent role in the tech industry. Now, as David traced patterns of stolen innovation through SEC filings and employee testimonies, he was beginning to understand why Richard had always deflected questions about his work with vague references to, quote, proprietary strategies and, quote, competitive sensitivity. His investigation had started with a tip from a former Nexus employee about systematic credit misattribution, but it had quickly expanded into something much larger. The preliminary evidence suggested a pattern of intellectual property theft that went beyond individual cases to represent a fundamental corruption of how innovation was valued and rewarded in Silicon Valley. David? His editor's voice crackled through his phone. How's the tech piece coming? We need to know if you're sitting on something big or if we should reassign resources. David looked at his evidence wall, his eyes stopping on a photograph he had pulled from LinkedIn. Lauren Fletcher, former Nexus employee and current CEO of Catalyst Design. Her story had emerged as a compelling case study, but there were gaps in his understanding that bothered his journalistic instincts. It's big, Maria. Bigger than I initially thought. But I need to talk to some key sources before I can nail down the scope. How big are we talking? Industry scandal or just another startup drama? David's gaze drifted to the family photo on his desk. Him and Richard at their father's retirement party 2 years ago, both wearing forced smiles that captured the distance between them. Potentially career-ending for some very prominent executives. I'll know more after this week's interviews. That evening's family dinner had been scheduled weeks ago, one of their mother's attempts to maintain family unity despite the growing ideological distance between her sons. David sat across from Richard at their parents' dining table in Marin County, watching his brother's polished performance as the successful tech executive. Charming stories about industry leadership, carefully modulated humility about his achievements, strategic name-dropping that impressed their parents without seeming boastful. David's working on another one of his corporate exposés, their mother announced proudly. Something about technology companies and intellectual property. Right up your alley, Richard. David felt his brother's attention sharpen, though Richard's expression remained casually interested. Oh? Anything I might have insights on? Actually, yes. David kept his voice neutral, but he was studying Richard's micro-expressions with the intensity that had made him effective at reading sources. I'm looking into patterns of innovation attribution in Silicon Valley, cases where individual contributors might not be receiving appropriate credit for their work. Richard's fork paused midway to his mouth for just a fraction of a second, a tell that David filed away for later analysis. That's a complex area. The line between individual research and strategic implementation can be pretty blurry in corporate environments. I'm sure it can be, David agreed. Though some of the cases I'm investigating seem pretty clear-cut. Documented instances of managers claiming credit for subordinates' innovations, using political positioning to obscure actual creation timelines. The silence that followed was heavy, with subtext that their parents couldn't decode. Richard recovered smoothly, launching into a discussion of industry best practices and the challenges of fairly attributing collaborative innovation. But David noticed the defensive undertones that hadn't been there before. Later, as they walked to their cars in the driveway, Richard's mask slipped slightly. You know, David, these kinds of stories can be really damaging to good people. Corporate dynamics are complicated. Things aren't always as simple as disgruntled employees make them seem. I'm sure they're not, David replied. That's why I verify everything. Multiple sources, documentation, pattern analysis. The truth usually emerges if you're patient enough. Richard's expression was unreadable in the dim light. Just be careful about whose careers you're impacting with speculation and hearsay. Driving home through the fog-shrouded hills, David felt the familiar tension between personal loyalty and professional obligation that had defined his relationship with his family. But the conversation had confirmed his suspicions. Richard knew more about this story than casual industry awareness would explain. The next morning, David placed a call to Lauren Fletcher's office. Her assistant was professional but protective, requiring extensive background verification before agreeing to schedule an interview. When Lauren finally called back, her voice carried the controlled authority of someone who had learned to be cautious about media exposure. Mr. Blackwood, I'm curious why an investigative journalist is interested in startup operations. We're pretty focused on product development rather than industry drama. Actually, Ms. Fletcher, I'm investigating patterns of intellectual property attribution in Silicon Valley. Your departure from Nexus Industries represents an interesting case study in how innovation gets credited or miscredited in corporate environments. The pause that followed was loaded with calculation. David could practically hear Lauren weighing the risks and benefits of engaging with his investigation. That's a complex topic, she said finally. What specific aspects are you examining? Whether the innovations attributed to certain executives actually originated with their teams. Whether there are systematic patterns of credit misattribution that might constitute intellectual property theft. Another pause, longer this time. When Lauren spoke again, her voice carried a new intensity. I'd be willing to discuss my experiences at Nexus, but I'd need to understand the scope of your investigation. Who else are you talking to? What kind of documentation are you working with? David smiled grimly. Lauren Fletcher was clearly someone with her own agenda, and he was beginning to understand that his investigation sat at the intersection of multiple competing interests. The question was whether seeking the truth would align with her goals or threaten them. Why don't we meet in person, he suggested. I think we have a lot to discuss. As he hung up the phone, David stared at his evidence wall with new understanding. This wasn't just a story about corporate corruption. It was about family, loyalty, and the complicated ways that personal relationships intersected with professional ethics. His investigation was about to force him to choose between protecting his brother and exposing the truth. And for the first time in his career, David wasn't certain which choice he was prepared to make. Marcus Thompson sat in his car outside the downtown San Francisco office building that housed Catalyst Design, his hands gripping the steering wheel as he rehearsed the conversation that would either secure his future or destroy it. The USB drive in his pocket contained 6 months of Catalyst's internal communications, client proposals, and strategic plans. Information that Richard Blackwood had made clear was worth a significant promotion and salary increase at Nexus. But the same drive also contained his application materials for Catalyst's senior developer position, complete with code samples that demonstrated his growing disillusionment with Richard's leadership style. Marcus had spent 3 sleepless nights perfecting his strategy of playing both sides, convinced that his MBA training and natural opportunism would let him navigate the corporate warfare between Lauren and Richard to his own advantage. What he hadn't anticipated was how quickly the situation would spiral beyond anyone's control. The morning had started with Richard's ultimatum delivered in his corner office with its view of the Bay Bridge. Marcus, I need those Catalyst files today. Lauren's planning something big. Our sources suggest she's preparing a hostile takeover attempt of our automation subsidiary. If we don't act now, she'll have the resources to destroy us piece by piece. Richard's paranoia had been escalating for weeks, fueled by the steady exodus of talent to Catalyst and the growing whispers in industry circles about intellectual property investigations. The confident executive who had once dismissed Lauren as a disgruntled individual contributor now saw her hand in every setback, every lost client, every negative article about Nexus's corporate culture. What exactly are you asking me to do? Marcus had replied, though they both knew he had been feeding information to Richard for months. I'm asking you to be loyal to the company that's invested in your career, Richard said, his voice carrying an edge that Marcus had never heard before. Jennifer Walsh was terminated this morning for corporate espionage. We have evidence she was selling confidential information to competitors. I'd hate to see other promising employees make similar mistakes. The threat was clear, but so was the opportunity. Richard was offering Marcus a senior director position and equity options, worth potentially millions, if Catalyst could be neutralized before their next funding round. All Marcus had to do was continue what he had been doing, collecting intelligence while positioning himself as a potential defector. Now, 6 hours later, Marcus walked into Catalyst's lobby with his laptop bag containing both the intelligence Richard wanted and the portfolio that might secure his position with Lauren's company. He had convinced himself that he was simply keeping his options open, but the acid churning in his stomach suggested his subconscious understood the moral implications better than his rational mind. Lauren's assistant directed him to the conference room where Lauren and Alex were reviewing client proposals. The contrast with Nexus was striking, where Richard's meetings felt like theatrical performances designed to showcase his leadership. Catalyst's working sessions had an intensity and focus that spoke to genuine innovation rather than political maneuvering. Marcus, Lauren greeted him with the calculating smile that had become her default expression. I hope you've had time to consider our conversation about your future here. Actually, I have some information that might be relevant to your strategic planning, Marcus said, pulling out his laptop. Richard's becoming increasingly desperate. He's terminated Jennifer Walsh and is talking about legal action against you personally. Alex looked up sharply. Legal action for what? Trade secret theft, tortious interference with business relationships, conspiracy to damage Nexus's competitive position. Marcus felt a surge of satisfaction at their concerned expressions. This was the kind of valuable intelligence that would secure his position, regardless of which company ultimately prevailed. Lauren's expression hardened in a way that reminded Marcus why Richard considered her dangerous. What kind of legal action? Lawsuits? Criminal referrals? Quote, dot. Both, potentially. He's hired Morrison and Associates, the firm that specializes in intellectual property warfare. They're building a case that your recruitment of Nexus employees constitutes systematic corporate espionage. The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Marcus watched Lauren process the information, her analytical mind clearly calculating responses and counter-strategies. When she spoke, her voice carried a cold authority that made Marcus suddenly uncertain about his own position in this war. Marcus, I appreciate the intelligence, but I'm curious. How exactly did you come by this information? The question hit like a physical blow. Marcus had been so focused on demonstrating his value that he had overlooked the obvious implication of his knowledge. His face must have revealed his panic because Alex leaned forward with new suspicion. You're still working for Richard, Alex said quietly. You're feeding him information about our operations. Marcus felt the carefully constructed house of cards collapsing around him. It's not that simple. I've been trying to gather intelligence for you too. Richard doesn't trust me completely. But he trusts you enough to tell you about legal strategies and personnel decisions, Lauren interrupted. And you trust him enough to meet with us right after receiving that information. The predatory calm in Lauren's voice terrified Marcus more than Richard's direct threats ever had. Richard's anger was hot and immediate, but Lauren's fury was cold and calculating, the kind that destroyed people systematically rather than impulsively. Lauren, I can explain. Oh, I think the explanation is clear, Lauren said, standing and moving to the window that overlooked the street. The question is what we do about it. Marcus realized with growing horror that he had walked into a trap. Lauren hadn't invited him here to offer him a job. She had suspected his duplicity and used this meeting to confirm it. The USB drive in his pocket suddenly felt like evidence of his own betrayal rather than valuable intelligence. You know, Marcus, Lauren continued, her voice conversational, corporate espionage works both ways. If Richard wants to play those games, maybe it's time we stopped being quite so ethical about our competition. Alex shifted uncomfortably. Lauren, what are you thinking? I'm thinking that Marcus here represents an opportunity. Richard trusts him, includes him in strategic discussions, shares sensitive information with him. Lauren turned back to face them, her expression carrying a ruthless calculation that made Marcus's blood run cold. The question is whether Marcus would prefer to be a liability for Richard or an asset for us. Marcus understood with crystalline clarity that he was no longer playing a game where he could hedge his bets. Lauren was offering him a choice between becoming her double agent or facing the consequences of his betrayal. Consequences that could include exposure to both companies and potential criminal charges for corporate espionage. "What exactly are you proposing?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer would require him to betray Richard as thoroughly as he had betrayed Lauren. Lauren's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "I'm proposing that you help us give Richard exactly what he deserves. And in return, you get to keep your career, instead of losing it." As Marcus stared into Lauren's cold eyes, he realized that the war between her and Richard had consumed everyone it touched. His attempt to play both sides had made him a casualty in a conflict that no longer had any innocent participants. The only question now was which master he would serve, and whether either choice would leave him with anything resembling his soul. The revolution had begun to devour its own children, and Marcus was about to discover that in corporate warfare there were no neutrals, only predators and prey. The emergency board meeting at Nexus Industries convened at 8 a.m. on a Tuesday that would reshape the careers of everyone involved. In the mahogany-paneled conference room on the 40th floor, 12 of Silicon Valley's most powerful executives sat around an oval table, their faces grim, as they reviewed the documents that had arrived via secure courier at 6 a.m. David Blackwood's exposé had gone live on TechCrunch at midnight, accompanied by supporting documentation that painted a devastating picture of systematic intellectual property theft spanning 5 years. The headline, "The Innovation Thieves: How Silicon Valley's Golden Boys Built Empires on Stolen Ideas," had already been shared 15,000 times and picked up by major news outlets across the country. Richard Blackwood sat at the head of the table, his usual confident demeanor replaced by the hollow-eyed desperation of someone watching their world collapse in real time. Across from him, the Nexus board members studied printouts of Lauren Fletcher's original code, time-stamped emails proving his systematic theft, and testimonials from former employees who had finally found the courage to speak on the record. "Richard," board chairwoman Margaret Chen's voice carried the cold authority of someone preparing to excise a cancer. "I think we need to hear your response to these allegations before we proceed." Richard's hands trembled slightly as he shuffled through papers that couldn't possibly contain an adequate defense. "Margaret, these are clearly allegations from a disgruntled former employee who has been systematically undermining our company since her departure. Lauren Fletcher has been conducting corporate espionage, stealing our clients, and..." "Richard." Chen's interruption was sharp enough to cut glass. "We've reviewed the documentation. The code analysis alone is conclusive. These innovations originated with Ms. Fletcher and other team members, not with you. The question isn't whether the allegations are true. The question is how we respond to the fact that they are true." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard looked around the table, seeking allies among executives who had celebrated his innovations at industry conferences, but found only the cold calculation of people protecting their own interests. "There are legal implications here," board member James Morrison said quietly. "Criminal implications. Intellectual property theft on this scale could trigger federal investigation." "It already has," Chen replied, sliding another document across the table. "The FBI's white-collar crime division opened an investigation this morning based on the evidence in Mr. Blackwood's article." Richard's face went ashen. "This is insane. I built this department's success. I turned individual research into market-ready innovations. That's what leadership means." "What leadership means," Chen interrupted, "is taking responsibility for failure as well as success. You've exposed this company to potentially massive legal liability, while systematically defrauding investors about the source of our competitive advantages." Across town, Lauren sat in her own conference room reading David's article on her laptop, feeling a complex mixture of vindication and anxiety. The exposé was thorough and damning, but it also revealed details about her own revenge campaign that she hadn't expected to become public knowledge. Alex sat beside her, his expression troubled, as he scrolled through the reader comments that were already analyzing the corporate warfare between Lauren and Richard. "Some of these responses are calling you just as manipulative as him," he said quietly. Lauren looked up from her screen. "Are they wrong?" The honesty of the question hung between them like a challenge. Alex had been struggling with Lauren's transformation for months, watching her evolve from the principled engineer he had fallen in love with into someone who wielded corporate politics like a weapon. "I don't know," Alex admitted. "The Lauren I met at Nexus wouldn't have used insider information to systematically destroy someone's career, even someone who deserved it." "The Lauren you met at Nexus was naive," Lauren replied. "She believed that excellence would be recognized and rewarded. She believed that playing by the rules would eventually lead to justice, that Lauren would still be watching Richard claim credit for her innovations while she remained invisible." Her phone buzzed with a call from Sarah Kim. Lauren hesitated before answering, knowing that her mentor's response to the public exposure would be complex. "Lauren," Sarah's voice was carefully controlled, "I've read David Blackwood's article. We need to talk. I assume you have concerns about the methods described in the piece. I have concerns about what this exposure means for your company, your legal liability, and your future in this industry," Sarah said. "But mostly I have concerns about whether you've become someone I can continue to support." The conversation that followed lasted an hour and ended with Sarah's withdrawal of her mentorship and strategic guidance, not because she disagreed with Lauren's goals, but because she could no longer endorse the methods Lauren had used to achieve them. By noon, the story had evolved beyond corporate scandal into a broader conversation about innovation attribution, gender dynamics in tech, and the ethical boundaries of competitive warfare. Lauren found herself simultaneously celebrated as a whistleblower who had exposed systematic theft, and criticized as someone who had abandoned moral high ground in pursuit of revenge. The legal ramifications were swift and severe. By 2 p.m., both Lauren and Richard had received federal subpoenas requiring their testimony before a grand jury investigating corporate fraud. Richard's position at Nexus became untenable within hours, as board members calculated the reputational and legal costs of continued association with him. Marcus Thompson, whose double-agent activities had been detailed in David's article, found himself unemployable at any major tech company and facing potential criminal charges for corporate espionage. His attempt to play both sides had made him a liability to everyone involved. Jennifer Walsh, whose cooperation with Lauren had been essential to building the case against Richard, faced her own legal jeopardy, but also received multiple job offers from companies that valued her willingness to expose corporate corruption. As the sun set over Silicon Valley, Lauren stood in her office watching news vans gather outside Nexus's headquarters. She had achieved everything she had set out to accomplish. Richard's career was destroyed, his theft was publicly exposed, and justice had been served. But the victory felt hollow in ways she hadn't anticipated. Alex found her there an hour later, his resignation letter in his hand. "I can't do this anymore, Lauren. I can't watch you become someone I don't recognize." Lauren took the letter without reading it, understanding that this moment had been inevitable since the day she had chosen revenge over redemption. "I know," she said quietly. "I'm not sure I recognize her either." The war was over, but the casualties were still being counted. And as Lauren looked at her reflection in the dark window, she wondered if winning a battle for justice was worth losing the person she had been before the fight began. The revolution had succeeded, but like all revolutions, it had changed everyone it touched, victors and victims alike. 6 months after David Blackwood's exposé had sent shockwaves through Silicon Valley, Lauren Fletcher sat in her therapist's office in Palo Alto, struggling to articulate the emptiness that had followed her complete victory over Richard. The autumn light filtered through Dr. Sarah Chen's office windows, casting long shadows that seemed to mirror the emotional landscape Lauren had been navigating since the dust settled. "You achieved everything you set out to accomplish," Dr. Chen observed, her voice carrying the gentle directness that had made these sessions both valuable and excruciating. "Richard's career is destroyed. Your innovations are recognized, your company is thriving. But you don't feel satisfied." Lauren stared at her hands, noting the calluses from stress-induced nail-biting that had developed over the past months. "I thought justice would feel different. I thought..." Vindication would be healing. But it wasn't? It was hollow. Richard got what he deserved, but I also became someone I don't recognize. Someone I'm not sure I like. The truth was more complex than she could easily articulate to Dr. Chen. Catalyst Design had indeed thrived in the aftermath of the scandal. The public exposure of her innovations had led to massive funding rounds, high-profile clients, and industry recognition that validated everything she had fought for. But the methods she had used to achieve that success had alienated the people whose respect she valued most. Alex had moved to Portland to work for a renewable energy startup, their relationship ending not with dramatic confrontation but with the quiet recognition that they had become incompatible people. His final email had been kind but clear. "I loved the person you were, Lauren. I hope you find your way back to her." Sarah Kim's withdrawal of mentorship had been even more devastating. The woman whose career path Lauren had studied and admired had made it clear that their values were no longer aligned. "Success built on others' destruction isn't success," Sarah had said in their final conversation. "It's just elaborate revenge." Now, 6 months later, Lauren was discovering that winning hadn't solved the deeper problems that had driven her quest for justice. The anger that had sustained her through the corporate warfare had evaporated, leaving behind a woman who had to live with the choices she had made and the person she had become. "Have you considered reaching out to Alex?" Dr. Chen asked. "Not to resume the relationship, but to begin the process of making amends for the harm your actions caused?" Lauren had considered it daily. Alex's LinkedIn updates showed him thriving in his new role, working on solar panel optimization algorithms that could revolutionize renewable energy adoption. He looked genuinely happy in ways that reminded her of the idealistic developer she had first recruited from Nexus. The distance between them felt like a chasm she had created through her own choices. "I don't know what I would say to him. Sorry I became a monster while pursuing justice. Sorry I chose revenge over our relationship." "Those might be good places to start," Dr. Chen suggested. "Accountability is the beginning of redemption." Across town, Richard Blackwood sat in a different kind of reflection space, the county jail where he was serving an 18-month sentence for corporate fraud and intellectual property theft. The federal investigation had moved swiftly, once David's article provided prosecutors with a roadmap to the evidence. Richard's conviction had been inevitable, once former employees found the courage to testify about his systematic exploitation. But prison had also provided Richard with something he had never experienced in his corporate career: time for genuine self-reflection. Without the constant validation of executive status and industry recognition, he was forced to confront the person he had become and the choices that had led to his destruction. His cellmate, a former Enron executive serving his own sentence for corporate malfeasance, had become an unlikely source of perspective. "The hardest part," the older man had said during one of their evening conversations, "isn't the loss of status or money. It's realizing that the person you thought you were was built on lies you told yourself." Richard was beginning to understand that his belief in his own innovative genius had been a comfortable fiction that allowed him to justify stealing others' work. The narrative of transforming quote, raw research into market-ready innovations had been a story he told himself to avoid confronting the reality that he was a fraud. The court-mandated therapy sessions were helping him trace the roots of his narcissism back to childhood experiences of conditional love based on achievement. His parents' validation had always been tied to success, leading him to prioritize recognition over integrity. But understanding the psychological origins of his behavior didn't absolve him of responsibility for the harm he had caused. "I destroyed people's careers," he said during a particularly difficult session with the prison psychologist, Lauren Fletcher, Alex Rivera, all the others whose work I stole. "I told myself I was being strategic, but I was just being selfish." The hardest part was accepting that his reputation had been built entirely on others' innovations. Every conference speech, every industry award, every moment of professional recognition had been based on theft. The person Silicon Valley had celebrated as a visionary leader had never existed. Jennifer Walsh had emerged from the scandal with her reputation intact and her conscience clear. The corporate espionage charges against her had been dropped, when prosecutors realized that her information sharing with Lauren had been motivated by genuine ethical concerns rather than financial gain. She now worked as a compliance officer for a nonprofit focused on corporate ethics, using her experience to help other companies avoid the toxic cultures that had enabled Richard's behavior. The hardest part, she reflected during a conference panel on corporate whistleblowing, was living with the knowledge of systematic fraud for years before finding the courage to act. I convinced myself that keeping my job was more important than protecting the people being harmed. Her new role allowed her to help other potential whistleblowers navigate the complex decisions around exposing corporate misconduct. The personal cost had been significant. Her 20-year career at Nexus was over, and she had faced months of legal uncertainty, but the psychological relief of no longer being complicit in Richard's theft had been transformative. Marcus Thompson had been less fortunate. His attempt to play both sides had made him unemployable in the tech industry and resulted in federal charges for corporate espionage. The 18-month probation sentence was lenient, but the professional destruction was complete. He now worked as a programming instructor at a community college, teaching basic coding skills to career changers and trying to rebuild some sense of purpose from the wreckage of his ambition. "I thought I was being smart," he told his students during a session on professional ethics that had become part of his standard curriculum. "I thought I could manipulate the situation to my advantage. What I learned is that when you try to serve two masters, you end up serving neither." The bitterness in his voice reflected the ongoing struggle to accept that his own choices had led to his downfall. Unlike Richard, who was beginning to show genuine remorse, Marcus remained primarily focused on his own victimization rather than the harm his duplicity had caused. David Blackwood had won a Pulitzer Prize for his exposé, but the personal cost had been the complete estrangement from his family. Richard's conviction had vindicated his journalistic instincts, but it had also destroyed the relationship with his brother that had been strained but not irreparable before the investigation. "I keep telling myself that the truth was more important than family loyalty," he confided to his editor during their weekly check-in. "But I'm not sure I believe that anymore." The success of his article had led to book deals and speaking engagements about corporate journalism, but David found himself questioning whether the professional vindication was worth the personal isolation. His parents hadn't spoken to him since Richard's sentencing, viewing his investigation as a betrayal that had destroyed their family. "The truth is important," his editor replied, "but so is figuring out how to live with the consequences of revealing it." As the first anniversary of the scandal approached, Lauren found herself walking through the Stanford campus, where she had first learned to believe that innovation could change the world. The naive optimism of her student years felt like it belonged to a different person, but she was beginning to understand that the choice between cynicism and hope was one she made every day. Her company was thriving, her innovations were changing the industry, and justice had been served. But the person who had achieved those victories was someone she was still learning to live with. The question that kept her awake at night wasn't whether she had been right to pursue justice. It was whether she could find her way back to the person she had been before the war began. The revolution was over, but the work of rebuilding herself was just beginning. And for the first time in months, Lauren was beginning to believe that redemption might be possible, even for someone who had won by becoming everything she had once fought against. 1 year after David Blackwood's exposé had torn through Silicon Valley like a digital wildfire, Lauren Fletcher stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of Catalyst Design's new headquarters in Mountain View, watching her team collaborate on innovations that would reshape how humans interacted with technology. The building buzzed with the creative energy she had dreamed of during those suffocating years at Nexus, but the satisfaction she felt was tempered by hard-won wisdom about the true cost of success. The company's growth had been extraordinary by any measure. Catalyst now employed over 200 people, had secured contracts with 3 Fortune 100 companies, and was preparing for an IPO that would value the company at over $2 billion. Her AI-assisted design platform had evolved far beyond its original conception, incorporating machine learning algorithms that could predict user needs with unprecedented accuracy. Industry analysts called it revolutionary, the kind of breakthrough that defined technological generations. But Lauren had learned that revolutionary success meant nothing if it came at the cost of her humanity. "The Morrison team wants to discuss expanding the accessibility framework," Alex Rivera said, appearing beside her at the window. His return to Catalyst 3 months earlier had been the result of careful conversations about accountability, forgiveness, and the possibility of building something genuinely innovative together. The romantic relationship was gone, replaced by a professional partnership built on honest recognition of how they had both changed. "What kind of expansion?" Lauren asked, turning from the window to face the man whose idealism had once frustrated her and now served as her moral compass. "Full-spectrum accessibility integration. Not just compliance with existing standards, but predictive accommodation for needs that haven't been formally recognized yet." Alex's excitement was genuine, untainted by the political calculations that had poisoned their earlier collaboration. The algorithms could identify usage patterns that suggest users are adapting to disabilities the system hasn't detected. Lauren felt the familiar surge of creative excitement that had driven her into technology in the first place. This was the kind of innovation that justified the battles she had fought, technology that would genuinely improve lives rather than simply generating profit or recognition. "Show me the preliminary research," she said, settling into one of the collaborative workstations that defined Catalyst's open design philosophy. "And Alex?" "Thank you for coming back." His smile carried complexity that acknowledged their shared history without dwelling on past mistakes. "Thank you for becoming someone worth coming back to." The conversation was interrupted by Lauren's assistant announcing an unexpected visitor. Richard Blackwood stood in the lobby, looking gaunt and nervous in a way that bore no resemblance to the confident executive who had once dismissed her innovations. His early release from prison for good behavior had been mentioned in a brief tech industry newsletter, but Lauren hadn't expected him to seek her out. "I wasn't sure you'd agree to see me," Richard said when Lauren met him in the small conference room near the lobby. His voice carried a humility that seemed genuine rather than performative. "I wasn't sure either," Lauren admitted. "What brings you here, Richard?" He looked older than his 53 years, worn down by legal proceedings and the systematic dismantling of everything he had built his identity around. But there was something clearer in his eyes, an absence of the desperate hunger for validation that had driven his theft. "I wanted to apologize," he said simply, "not because my lawyers advised it, or because it might help with restitution proceedings. Because I owe you an acknowledgement of the harm I caused." Lauren studied his expression, her analytical mind automatically searching for signs of manipulation or strategic positioning. But the Richard sitting across from her seemed genuinely different, broken down and rebuilt into someone capable of authentic remorse. "Prison gave me time to understand what I had become," Richard continued. "I convinced myself that I was providing strategic leadership, that I was transforming your technical work into market-ready innovations. But the truth is that I was stealing your creativity because I had none of my own." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither had expected to cross. Lauren felt a complex mixture of vindication and sadness. Vindication that her perception of his theft was finally acknowledged. Sadness that it had taken the destruction of his career for him to recognize the truth. "I can't undo the years I stole from you," Richard said. "I can't restore the recognition you should have received, or repair the relationships that were damaged by my actions. But I can acknowledge that your success here, this company, these innovations, this industry recognition, all of it was earned through your own brilliance, not despite my interference." Lauren was quiet for a long moment, processing emotions she hadn't expected to feel. The man who had driven her to abandon her principles in pursuit of justice was now offering the genuine accountability she had never received during their corporate warfare. "Why now?" she asked. "Why come here and apologize when you could have just served your time and disappeared?" Richard's laugh was bitter but self-aware. "Because I realized that the person I was trying to protect, the successful executive, the industry visionary, never actually existed. The only person left is someone who has to live with what he did to others." They talked for another hour, a conversation that covered 5 years of systematic exploitation and the year of warfare that had followed. Richard didn't attempt to minimize his actions or seek forgiveness he knew he hadn't earned. Instead, he offered something Lauren hadn't realized she needed: a genuine understanding of how his narcissism had distorted his perception of their professional relationship. "I told myself that your technical brilliance needed my strategic vision to be valuable," Richard said as their conversation wound toward conclusion. "The truth is that your innovations were always complete. They didn't need me to make them meaningful. I needed them to make myself feel meaningful." When Richard left, Lauren sat alone in the conference room processing the encounter. The anger that had sustained her through the corporate battle was finally, completely gone. In its place was something more complex, a recognition that justice without mercy was hollow, but that mercy without accountability was meaningless. That evening, Lauren found herself in Sarah Kim's office for the first time since their relationship had ended over ethical concerns. Sarah had agreed to the meeting after Lauren's persistent requests, but her expression was carefully neutral. "I heard about Richard's visit," Sarah said. "Word travels quickly in our industry." "I wanted to talk to you about what comes next," Lauren said. "For Catalyst, for my leadership, for the kind of company I want to build going forward." Sarah leaned back in her chair, studying Lauren with the analytical intensity that had made her such an effective mentor. "What kind of company do you want to build?" "One that proves you can compete ethically and still win," Lauren said. "One that demonstrates that innovation built on genuine collaboration is more powerful than innovation stolen through manipulation." The conversation that followed lasted 3 hours and ended with Sarah's cautious agreement to resume their mentorship relationship, contingent on Lauren's demonstrated commitment to ethical leadership principles. It wasn't a complete restoration of their previous dynamic, but it was a foundation for rebuilding trust that had been shattered by Lauren's pursuit of revenge. 6 months later, Catalyst's IPO was the most successful tech offering of the year, but Lauren's satisfaction came from different metrics. Employee satisfaction surveys showed unprecedented levels of job fulfillment and creative autonomy. The company's accessibility initiatives had been adopted as industry standards by competitors who recognized their genuine value. Most importantly, the innovations emerging from Catalyst were genuinely collaborative. No single person claimed credit for breakthroughs that resulted from team efforts. David Blackwood published a follow-up article on Catalyst's success, focusing on the company's ethical leadership model and its demonstration that corporate accountability could coexist with financial success. The piece helped repair some of the industry relationships that had been damaged during the original scandal, while establishing Lauren as a thought leader on sustainable innovation practices. The article also included a brief section on Richard's post-prison work as a nonprofit consultant, helping other executives navigate ethical leadership challenges. His rehabilitation wasn't complete and might never be, but his willingness to use his experience to prevent similar harm demonstrated that redemption was possible, even for those who had fallen furthest. On a foggy Thursday evening, 1 year after their reconciliation, Lauren and Alex sat in the same Palo Alto coffee shop where she had first met with Sarah Kim. They were reviewing accessibility research that could help users with cognitive disabilities navigate complex digital interfaces, work that combined technical innovation with genuine social impact. "Do you ever regret it?" Alex asked as they packed up their laptops. "The whole war with Richard, the methods you used, the person you became?" Lauren considered the question while watching commuters hurry past the window, each absorbed in their own struggles with ambition, justice, and moral compromise. "I regret becoming someone I didn't recognize," she said finally. "I regret the damage to our relationship and the loss of Sarah's trust. I regret that it took so long to understand that building something better was more important than destroying something worse." "But you don't regret exposing Richard's theft?" "No," Lauren said without hesitation. "That needed to happen. The question wasn't whether to pursue justice. It was how to pursue it without losing myself in the process." As they walked to their cars through the cooling evening air, Lauren reflected on the journey that had transformed her from an overlooked engineer to a CEO, to someone who understood that true success required integrating personal integrity with professional achievement. The naive optimism of her Stanford years was gone forever, replaced by a harder but more durable wisdom about the complexities of moral leadership. The revolution was complete, but unlike most revolutions, this one had ended with construction rather than destruction. Catalyst Design stood as proof that corporate warfare could end in something better than mutual assured destruction, if the combatants were willing to evolve beyond their original injuries. Lauren Fletcher had learned to build empires without becoming a monster. The question now was whether Silicon Valley was ready to learn the same lesson, or if the next generation of innovators would repeat the cycle of exploitation and revenge that had defined her own transformation. The answer, she understood, depended on whether they could find the courage to choose creation over destruction, collaboration over competition, and justice over revenge. It was a choice she would have to make every day for the rest of her career, but for the first time since leaving Nexus, Lauren was confident she knew which path led toward the future she wanted to build. The end. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. Quote.